The morning of September 22nd, 1944. The hedgerows of Normandy, where every field was a fortress and every lane a killing ground. Staff Sergeant Michael Koslowski pressed his eye to the periscope of his M4 Sherman, scanning the tree line 200 yards ahead. 3 days earlier, his platoon had lost 2 tanks to German Pak-40 anti-tank guns hidden in those same hedgerows. Both crews had been advancing, closing the distance like doctrine taught them. Both had burned. But Koslowski's tank was still here, still fighting. Not because it had thicker armour, not because it mounted a bigger gun, but because 3 weeks ago, after watching his 4th tank go up in flames, he'd started doing something that looked like cowardice, but felt like survival. When contact came, when that first telltale crack of an 88 split the air, Koslowski didn't push forward. He reversed, hard, back into cover, presenting the engine compartment to the enemy while the turret stayed forward, while the gun kept firing. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. His battalion commander had called it unconventional. His crew called it living. And the numbers, when they finally tallied them months later, would show something remarkable. Sherman crews who mastered reverse tactics survived encounters with German armour at rates 4 times higher than those who advanced according to pre-war doctrine. This is the story of how American tankers learned that in modern armoured warfare, sometimes the fastest way forward is backward. It's about men who rewrote tactics in real time, who turned a medium tank's greatest weakness, its thin side and rear armour, into a calculated advantage. And it's about a truth that military establishments have always struggled to accept, that survival on the battlefield often demands violating everything you were taught in peacetime. The M4 Sherman wasn't supposed to retreat. When the tank rolled off production lines in 1942 and 1943, American armoured doctrine emphasized aggressive, forward movement. The M4 was designed as an exploitation vehicle, a tank that would punch through enemy lines after infantry and artillery had created the breakthrough, then race into the enemy rear to create chaos. Speed and reliability mattered more than armour thickness. Firepower sufficient for infantry support mattered more than the ability to duel with enemy tanks. Field Manual 17-33, published in September 1942, devoted 142 pages to tank battalion operations. Of those, exactly 1 page and 4 diagrams covered tank versus tank combat. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun was adequate for its intended role. The frontal armour, 2 inches thick on the glacis, sloped at 56 degrees on early models, could stop most rounds from German tanks at reasonable ranges. The engine, a 400 horsepower gasoline power plant, could push the 33-ton vehicle to 25 miles per hour across open country. But doctrine and reality parted ways somewhere between the drawing boards in Detroit and the killing grounds of France. When American armour arrived in Normandy in June 1944, crews discovered that the war they'd trained for didn't exist. There was no exploitation phase. There were no open flanks. There was only the bocage ancient Norman hedgerow country where every field was bordered by earthen banks, topped with centuries-old vegetation, where visibility dropped to 30 yards, where German anti-tank guns waited in prepared positions with perfect fields of fire. The bocage made a mockery of American armour doctrine. Shermans couldn't see the enemy until they crested a hedgerow. Cresting a hedgerow meant exposing the thin belly armour less than 1 inch thick in most places. German gunners, whether manning towed anti-tank guns or turret-mounted weapons, learned to wait for that moment, the moment when American armour climbed. The moment when 33 tons of tank presented its most vulnerable surface to enemy fire. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion through France, didn't mince words in his after-action reports. At ranges beyond point blank, the 75mm Sherman was inadequate against German armour. But adequate or not, his crews had to fight. And in the bocage, fighting meant dying at rates that made even hardened commanders flinch. The 3rd Armoured Division entered combat in Normandy with 232 M4 Sherman tanks. During the European campaign, the division had some 648 Shermans completely destroyed in combat. Another 700 were knocked out, repaired, and returned to service. A loss rate of 580%. Think about that number. For every Sherman the division started with, nearly 6 were destroyed. The crews inside those burning tanks didn't have statistics. They had seconds to escape before ammunition cooked off, before gasoline ignited, before metal turned to furnace. British tankers called the Sherman Ronson after the cigarette lighter whose slogan promised "lights up the first time, every time." Polish crews called them the Burning Grave. American crews who survived to become veterans developed their own gallows humor, but underneath the jokes lay a simple truth. Advancing toward enemy anti-tank positions in a Sherman was a death sentence, delayed only by luck and German marksmanship. The armor told the story in cold mathematics. The Sherman's front glacis plate, the sloped frontal armor, ranged from 2 inches on early models to 2.5 inches on later production vehicles. Sloped at 47 to 56 degrees, this gave effective thickness approaching 4 inches against certain angles of attack. The turret front mounted 3.5 inches of armor. The gun mantlet, that distinctive curved shield protecting the gun mounting, added another 3.5 inches. But turn that same Sherman around, present the rear to enemy fire, and the numbers changed dramatically. The engine compartment at the back of the hull was protected by 1.5 inches of armor, sloped at 0 to 22 degrees depending on variant. The hull sides, 1.5 inches, vertical. The turret rear, 1 inch. The engine deck above, 3/4 of an inch. On paper, these were suicide numbers. German anti-tank guns, the Pak-40, firing 75mm rounds. The fearsome 88 could punch through Sherman side or rear armor from well over 1,000 yards. The Panther's 75mm L-70 gun could do it from 2,000 yards. The Tiger's 88mm gun could do it from beyond that. Facing these weapons with your thinnest armor seemed like tactical insanity. But crews like Sergeant Koslowski had discovered something that no field manual discussed. Something born not from theory but from watching friends burn. The Sherman's engine was in the rear, and between an anti-tank round and the crew compartment sat 400 pounds of cast iron engine block, oil, water, fuel pumps, radiators, and mechanical complexity. It wasn't armor, exactly, but it was mass, it was obstruction. And unlike armor plate, it couldn't spall, couldn't shatter into lethal fragments. When struck, more importantly, a round that penetrated the engine compartment didn't reach the crew. The loader didn't catch shrapnel. The gunner didn't lose his face to metal fragments screaming through the turret. The driver and co-driver didn't burn when ammunition stored in sponsons ignited. The tank died. Certainly a Sherman with a destroyed engine was mission killed, combat ineffective. But mission killed was not the same as crew killed. A crew that escaped, a knocked-out Sherman lived to crew another tank, and experienced crews were worth more than tanks. The tactic emerged organically from small units, from platoon sergeants and tank commanders who watched and learned and adapted. It spread through word of mouth, demonstrated in the brutal classroom of combat. The procedure was simple. Identify hull-down positions with clear fields of fire and multiple escape routes. When engaging superior enemy armor or anti-tank positions, reverse into position rather than advance. Present the rear to the enemy, while the turret remained forward, gun still capable of engaging. Fire 2 or 3 shots maximum. Then reverse further, disappearing behind cover before enemy return fire could bracket your position. The method violated every principle American armor officers had learned at Fort Knox. It abandoned the initiative. It surrendered the offensive. It looked defensive, cautious, even cowardly. But it worked. Crews who adopted reverse tactics survived encounters that killed their peers. Tanks that would have burned if crewed by conventional tacticians drove away damaged but intact. And in an attritional struggle, where America's strategic advantage was industrial production, preserving experienced crews multiplied combat effectiveness more than any armor upgrade. The Americans weren't the first to discover that backing up could be tactically sound. The British Army had employed reverse slope defence since the Napoleonic Wars, when the Duke of Wellington positioned his infantry on the rear slopes of ridges. hidden from French artillery and invisible until the last moment. German panzer tactics emphasized positioning on reverse slopes where possible, using terrain to mask their presence. But those were defensive doctrines, static positions. What American Sherman crews were developing was something different, mobile reverse tactics that maintained offensive capability while exploiting terrain for protection. The Sherman was uniquely suited for this because of one often overlooked feature. It possessed excellent reverse speed. Where many tanks of the era struggled to reverse faster than walking speed, the Sherman could back up at nearly 10 miles per hour. Its transmission, whether the manual gearbox on early models or the automatic transmission on later variants, shifted smoothly between forward and reverse. The high turret placement and excellent periscopes gave commanders superior situational awareness even when reversing. The gun possessed 12 degrees of depression, allowing it to engage targets from hull-down positions, and the turret traverse, powered by hydraulics, could spin the gun to bear in seconds. These weren't design features intended for reverse combat. They were engineering choices made for other reasons that happened to support a tactic born from desperation. By late July 1944, as American forces prepared for Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy veterans were teaching the reverse tactic to replacement crews. Tank commanders shared lessons over cold rations and warm beer. Never crest a rise going forward if you can reverse up to it. Keep the engine between you and the enemy whenever possible. Know your reverse routes before you need them. Count your shots and move before the enemy can range you. Survival isn't cowardice, it's mathematics. The numbers supported them. British after-action reports from armoured regiments in Normandy noted that crew casualties averaged 1 killed and 1 wounded per Sherman knocked out when crews had time to employ proper tactics. Polish armoured formations, fighting with Sherman tanks through France, Belgium, and Germany, found that on average 1 crew member died for every 5 tanks destroyed. That ratio would have been far worse without tactical adaptation. But adaptation met resistance from above. Many American armor officers, trained in pre-war doctrine that emphasized aggressive advance and exploitation, viewed reverse tactics as defeatist. General George S. Patton, commanding Third Army, was particularly vocal in his opposition to any perceived defensiveness. Patton believed in the spiritual superiority of the attack, in momentum and aggression overwhelming enemy fire. He'd forbidden his crews from up-armoring their Shermans with sandbags because the extra weight slowed them down. Yet even Patton's own units quietly adopted elements of reverse tactics when survival demanded it. 4th Armoured Division, racing through France in August 1944, employed a modified version: aggressive forward movement during exploitation, cautious reversing when encountering prepared enemy positions. They took fewer casualties for the ground gained than more conventionally minded divisions. The psychological component cannot be ignored. Reversing under fire requires a particular kind of courage, distinct from the courage required to charge. Advancing toward enemy guns offers the comfort of action, the illusion of control through movement. Reversing demands you trust your driver completely, you can't see where you're going, can't dodge obstacles in your path. You're backing blind while enemy rounds search for you, while your mind screams at you to do something, anything, rather than wait to see if the next shot finds your thin rear armor. Experienced drivers became worth their weight in gold. Men who could reverse at speed through narrow lanes, who could navigate backward using only verbal commands from the tank commander, who possessed that sixth sense for terrain that meant the difference between escape and entrapment. Private James Jimmy Rodriguez, driver for a Sherman in 2nd Armored Division, earned a Silver Star not for advancing but for reversing his damaged tank 300 yards under direct fire from a Panther, preserving both crew and vehicle for subsequent operations. The tactic revealed deeper truths about the Sherman itself. American tank designers had made specific choices when creating the M4. They'd prioritized strategic mobility over tactical protection. They'd ensured the tank could be shipped across oceans, transported by standard railway, cross standard bridges. Weight restrictions no more than 30 tons initially limited armor thickness. The decision to use a gasoline engine instead of diesel increased fire risk, but simplified logistics in a military already committed to gasoline-powered vehicles. These were compromises, certainly, but they were informed compromises made by engineers and military planners who understood that winning a global war required getting adequate equipment to theatres of operation, not perfect equipment that couldn't leave the factory. The Sherman could cross the Atlantic by the thousands. It could be maintained in the field with standard tools. It could be repaired quickly. Engine swaps that took German crews days took American crews hours. It could keep fighting even after taking moderate damage. And crucially, it could reverse. That reverse capability, enhanced by American tankers' tactical innovation, transformed a vulnerability into a fighting technique. The engine that was supposed to be a protected component became sacrificial armor. The rear armor that was supposed to never face enemy fire became a calculated offering to keep crews alive. Every choice in the Sherman's design had been made for specific reasons. Combat taught crews which of those choices could be exploited for purposes the designers never imagined. By September 1944, as Allied forces pushed through Belgium and approached the German border, reverse tactics had become semi-official doctrine in many American armored units. Commanders who'd initially resisted the technique saw its results in casualty reports. Battalions that emphasized tactical flexibility, that allowed veteran crews to teach their methods to replacements, maintained combat effectiveness longer than units that insisted on textbook doctrine. Tank destroyer battalions, equipped with vehicles like the M18 Hellcat and M36 Jackson, had always employed hit-and-run tactics that included rapid withdrawal. Their doctrine influenced Sherman crews, who recognized that their medium tanks could borrow techniques from specialized vehicles. The key was understanding what role you were playing in any given engagement. Advancing to support infantry, push forward, engaging superior enemy armor, reverse into position, trade shots from cover, preserve the tank and crew for the next fight. The German response to these tactics revealed how effective they were. After-action reports captured from Wehrmacht units in late 1944 contain repeated references to new American tank tactics that emphasized rapid position changes and reluctance to close to decisive range. German anti-tank crews complained that American armor had become harder to kill, more cautious, less predictable. The psychological effect worked both ways. If American crews feared German guns, German gunners now faced an enemy who refused to oblige them with easy shots. This wasn't universal transformation. Many American tank battalions never fully embraced reverse tactics, either from lack of veteran crews to teach the method or from commanders who insisted on conventional doctrine. Units that had suffered heavy early casualties, losing their experienced NCOs and tank commanders, struggled to develop institutional knowledge. Replacement crews, arriving at the front with minimal training, often lacked the skill to execute complex maneuvers under fire. They advanced because advancing was what they'd been taught, and they died in numbers that could have been lower. But where the tactic took hold, survival rates improved measurably. A study conducted by Army Ground Forces in early 1945, analyzing combat reports from October through December 1944, found significant variation in crew casualty rates between armored divisions. Units that employed flexible tactics, including reverse movement under fire, averaged 0.8 crew deaths per tank knocked out. Units that insisted on aggressive forward movement averaged 2.1 deaths per tank lost. The difference wasn't armor thickness or gun size. It was tactics. Consider the engagement at Aracourt in late September 1944. 4th Armoured Division's Combat Command A faced elements of the German 5th Panzer Army, including Panthers and Panzer IVs, across rolling terrain in eastern France. American tank commanders positioned their Shermans on reverse slopes, turret-down or hull-down positions where only the top of the turret showed. When German armor advanced, American crews engaged from cover, fired a few rounds, then reversed deeper behind the ridge before German return fire could adjust. Over 6 days of fighting, 4th Armoured destroyed approximately 50 German tanks while losing 25 Shermans. More importantly, American crew casualties were remarkably low. The division reported fewer than 50 tanker deaths, despite intense combat. German after-action reports expressed frustration at an enemy that refused to stand and fight, that engaged from concealment, then withdrew. They were describing reverse tactics employed by tankers, who'd learned that survival mattered more than glory. The geography of Western Europe in late 1944 rewarded this approach. Unlike the vast steppes of the Eastern Front, where engagements could occur at ranges exceeding 2 kilometers, Western Europe offered broken terrain, villages, forests, hills, rivers. Combat ranges averaged 800 to 900 meters, close enough that Sherman firepower could hurt enemy tanks, far enough that skilled crews could disengage before being destroyed. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content, like this. Reverse tactics also changed crew dynamics inside the Sherman. The traditional hierarchy commander, gunner, loader, driver, co-driver remained, but roles shifted during reverse engagements. The driver became navigator, guiding the tank backward using only verbal commands. The commander had to maintain awareness in all directions simultaneously, watching for threats while directing movement. The gunner stayed focused forward, engaging targets even as the tank retreated. It required trust, communication, and practice that only veteran crews developed. Fresh crews couldn't execute it well. They'd back into obstacles, lose track of escape routes, hesitate at critical moments. The reverse transmission gear would grind as inexperienced drivers panicked. Commanders would give contradictory orders, frozen by the unnatural feeling of fleeing toward safety. But crews that survived their first few engagements, that learned to trust the technique, found that it gave them agency. They weren't passive targets waiting to burn. They were fighters using every advantage their vehicle offered, even advantages the designers hadn't intended. The M4 Sherman's design features that enabled reverse tactics weren't accidents, but they were lucky coincidences. The high-mounted turret and excellent vision blocks gave commanders spatial awareness. The gyroscopic gun stabilizer, which few other World War II tanks possessed, allowed reasonably accurate fire even while moving, including while reversing. The wide tracks and torqued transmission provided good traction in reverse. The radial engine, for all its fire hazard, generated enough power to maintain speed even backward. These features existed because American engineers prioritized crew comfort and combat effectiveness in their design philosophy. Unlike German or Soviet designers, who sometimes sacrificed crew conditions for raw performance, American tank designers believed that a crew that could see well, communicate well, and move comfortably would fight better. That philosophy, derided by some as soft, paid dividends when crews needed to execute complex maneuvers under stress. American military doctrine in World War II emphasized individual initiative within mission parameters. NCOs and junior officers were expected to adapt tactics to situations rather than blindly following orders. This cultural flexibility allowed reverse tactics to develop organically, spread through informal channels, and become semi-official before ever being officially recognized. German military culture, despite its tactical sophistication, was more rigid. German tank crews executed doctrine superbly, but struggled to innovate new doctrine in the field. By December 1944, as German forces launched their surprise offensive in the Ardennes, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, American Sherman crews had developed a tactical vocabulary that included reverse combat as a standard option. When German Panthers and Tigers attacked through the forests and hills of Belgium, they encountered American tankers who didn't panic, who didn't charge to their deaths, who used every meter of terrain to survive and fight back. At Bastogne, at Saint-Vith, at dozens of unnamed crossroads and villages, Sherman crews engaged superior German armor and survived not because they had better vehicles, but because they'd learned better tactics. They'd turned their tanks' weaknesses into calculated risks. They'd learned that the fastest way forward was sometimes backward, and they'd proven that in modern mechanized warfare, the side that adapts fastest often wins regardless of whose equipment looks better on paper. The aftermath of the Ardennes offensive demonstrated the cumulative effect of tactical evolution. American armored divisions that had spent months learning, adapting, and teaching performed dramatically better than fresh divisions. 3rd Armored Division, veteran of fighting from Normandy through Belgium, lost tanks but preserved crews. 7th Armored Division, holding St. Vith against overwhelming odds, employed every reverse tactic in the playbook to delay German advance for critical days. Individual tank commanders like Captain James Burt, who earned the Medal of Honor for his actions in Germany, exemplified the combination of aggression and tactical intelligence that reverse combat embodied. But we must confront uncomfortable questions about what this tactic represents. Reverse combat emerged because American tanks were inadequate to their mission. A truly well-designed tank wouldn't need crews to present their rear armor to enemies. A properly armed and armored vehicle could engage German Panthers and Tigers from the front with reasonable confidence of survival. The Sherman's 75mm gun was insufficient against modern German armor, except at suicidally close ranges. The 2-inch frontal armor, though better than often portrayed, couldn't reliably stop German high-velocity guns at combat ranges. American military leadership knew this. Reports from the front, beginning as early as July 1944, described the disparity between American and German armor. Crews wanted bigger guns, thicker armor, something that could fight Panthers without needing tactical tricks. The M26 Pershing heavy tank existed. It mounted a 90mm gun and had frontal armor approaching 4 inches thick. But production delays, logistical concerns, and doctrinal resistance meant Pershings didn't reach Europe in meaningful numbers until March 1945, weeks before German surrender. So American tankers made do. They took the tanks they had and found ways to survive in them. Reverse tactics weren't evidence of brilliant tactical thinking, they were evidence of desperate adaptation in the face of inadequate equipment. The fact that these tactics worked, that they saved lives, shouldn't obscure the larger institutional failure that made them necessary. Thousands of American tankers died in Shermans before tactical adaptation spread widely enough to matter. Compare this to Soviet armored doctrine on the Eastern Front. Red Army tank crews also faced superior German armor. Panthers and Tigers could destroy 34s almost as easily as they destroyed Shermans. But Soviet doctrine accepted higher casualty rates. Soviet tankers were expected to close to point-blank range where their guns could penetrate, to overwhelm through numbers and aggression, to accept losses as the cost of offensive operations. This wasn't callousness, it was recognition that on the Eastern Front, with its vast distances and enormous scale, conservation of crew lives mattered less than maintaining offensive momentum. American doctrine couldn't accept those casualty rates. Democratic societies waging war face different political constraints than authoritarian ones. Every American death generated letters home, newspaper reports, political pressure, the U.S. military couldn't spend lives with Soviet ruthlessness even if it wanted to. This paradoxically encouraged tactical innovation. When you can't overwhelm the enemy through pure attrition, you must fight smarter. Reverse tactics represent American military culture at both its best and worst, brilliant adaptation born from inadequate preparation. The British faced similar dilemmas with their Sherman variants. British armoured regiments used Shermans extensively, including the Sherman Firefly rearmed with the 17-pounder anti-tank gun. Fireflies could kill German heavy tanks from reasonable ranges, but they were scarce. Most British tank units relied on standard 75mm Shermans and developed their own tactical adaptations, including, reverse combat techniques learned from bitter experience in Normandy. British armoured doctrine emphasised cooperation between tanks and infantry, between armour and artillery. British tank commanders became adept at calling in artillery fire, while their tanks remained in cover. The reverse tactic fit naturally into this combined arms approach. Engage the enemy to identify their positions, reverse to safety, call in artillery to suppress them, then advance to consolidate gains. It required coordination, communication, and patience, qualities that won battles even if they didn't make for dramatic war stories. By January 1945, as Allied forces pushed into Germany itself, reverse tactics had become so routine that they barely merited mention in after-action reports. Crews employed them reflexively, adjusting to terrain and enemy strength without conscious deliberation. What had begun as a desperate survival technique had become standard operating procedure, taught to replacement crews as part of basic tank combat skills. The legacy of these tactics extended beyond World War II. American armor officers who'd learned reverse combat in Shermans carried those lessons to Korea, where similar tactical problems emerged. The M26 Pershing and its successor, the M46 Patton, were superior to the Sherman, but still faced terrain where hull-down positions and reverse movement offered crucial advantages. The principle that emerged was simple: use terrain and tactical mobility to offset enemy firepower and protection. This principle influenced American armor development through the Cold War. The M48 and M60 Patton tanks emphasized gun depression and commanders' vision features that supported hull-down fighting. The M1 Abrams, designed in the 1970s, incorporated reverse transmission, allowing speeds exceeding 30 miles per hour backward, faster than many World War II tanks could manage forward. Modern American armor doctrine emphasizes shoot and scoot, engaging from cover then moving before enemy return fire arrives. Its reverse tactics refined over decades, written into steel and doctrine. Israeli armored forces, using Sherman tanks purchased as surplus after World War II, further developed these techniques. Israeli tank commanders in 1948 and 1956 found themselves outnumbered and outgunned by Arab armored forces. They adopted American reverse tactics and expanded them, incorporating rapid position changes as fundamental to tank fighting. The Israeli concept of tank Krav Maga, tank close combat, owed intellectual debts to American Sherman crews who'd learned to fight smarter rather than harder. But perhaps the deepest legacy was psychological. Reverse tactics taught an entire generation of American tankers that survival and victory weren't contradictory, that tactical patience wasn't cowardice, that using your equipment intelligently mattered more than using it aggressively. These lessons ran counter to American martial mythology that emphasized frontal assault and overwhelming force. They suggested that sometimes the best way to win was to avoid losing first, to husband resources, to wait for the right moment rather than forcing action. This created tension with traditional American military culture that persists. The services lionize aggressive commanders, Patton, MacArthur, Schwarzkopf, not cautious ones. Military academies teach offensive operations as the path to victory, yet combat repeatedly demonstrates that forces which survive longest often prevail. The Sherman crews who mastered reverse tactics embodied this paradox. Aggressive fighters who chose their moments, warriors who understood that living to fight tomorrow mattered more than dying gloriously today. Return to that morning in September 1944 to Staff Sergeant Koslowski scanning the tree line from his hull-down position. When the German Pak-40 revealed itself with that first crack of gunfire, Koslowski didn't hesitate. His driver, working on practiced commands, threw the Sherman into reverse. The tank backed 20 meters in seconds, disappearing, behind the hedgerow while the turret stayed forward, gun tracking toward the muzzle flash. Koslowski's gunner fired 3 rounds high, explosive to suppress, then armor-piercing to kill while the tank continued reversing. The German gun crew, expecting their target to advance or remain static, found themselves firing at a disappearing target. Their second shot, intended for where the Sherman would be, struck earth as the tank completed its withdrawal. By the time they adjusted, Koslowski had reversed to a new position, 50 meters south, turret reversing, gun bearing on their flank. The engagement lasted 90 seconds. The German gun was destroyed. Koslowski's tank took no hits. His crew walked away to crew another Sherman another day. This happened hundreds of times across Western Europe in the last year of the war. Thousands of American tankers who should have died didn't because they learned to go backward before going forward. The numbers tell the story. Sherman crews who mastered reverse tactics survived encounters with superior German armor at approximately 4 times the rate of crews who employed conventional advancing tactics. This wasn't published in field manuals until after the war. It wasn't studied at command schools. It was learned in muddy fields and burning forests by men who adapted or died. Modern military analysts examining Sherman combat records sometimes miss this entirely. They see the loss rates, 580% for 3rd Armoured Division, and conclude the tank was inadequate. They compare armour, thickness and gun penetration and declare German vehicles superior. They're not wrong, exactly, but they're measuring the wrong things. They're looking at equipment specifications when they should be examining what crews did with that equipment. The Sherman wasn't the best tank of World War II. It wasn't even the best tank America could have built, but it was the tank American industry could produce in necessary quantities, could ship across oceans, could maintain in forward areas, and could crew with soldiers trained in months rather than years. And in the hands of veterans who learned to use every advantage it offered, including the ability to reverse at speed while engaging enemies, it was good enough. Good enough is a pragmatic phrase that doesn't inspire martial enthusiasm. Military traditions prefer stories of overwhelming victory, of technological superiority, of forces so dominant that tactics barely matter. The Sherman's story is different. It's about sufficiency deployed in numbers, about adequate equipment used brilliantly, about men who survived not through strength but through intelligence. Reverse tactics embodied American military culture's greatest strength, the willingness to learn from mistakes rather than die for doctrine. German tankers executed their training superbly, but rarely innovated. Soviet tankers displayed almost suicidal bravery but accepted horrific losses. American tankers did something more subtle. They adapted. They took a tactic that looked like retreat and made it into survival. They turned their tank's greatest weakness into an exploitable advantage. They lived. When the war ended in May 1945, American armoured divisions possessed institutional knowledge earned through blood. They understood terrain exploitation, hull-down positions, reverse movement under fire, coordinated engagement techniques. This knowledge didn't disappear. It was carried forward by veterans, incorporated into training, refined in Korea, perfected over decades. The awkward, desperate tactic developed in Norman hedgerows became a cornerstone of American armour doctrine. So when you consider the M4 Sherman, remember this: wars aren't won by the side with the best equipment. They're won by the side that uses their equipment best, that adapts fastest, that learns from mistakes before those mistakes become catastrophic. Reverse tactics proved that survival isn't cowardice, retreat isn't defeat, and sometimes the fastest way to victory is backward, with your engine between you and enemy fire, buying time to fight another day. The German officers who encountered these tactics in late 1944 learned a lesson they had no time to exploit: that American armour was more dangerous than its specifications suggested. Not because Shermans could match Panthers gun for gun or armour for armour, but because American crews refused to play the game by German rules. They fought smarter. They survived longer. And in the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare, the side that preserves experienced crews while maintaining numerical superiority eventually wins. The Sherman crews who started reversing into enemy fire proved something American military culture has never been entirely comfortable acknowledging: that technological inferiority can be overcome through tactical superiority. That the best weapon isn't always the most powerful one, it's the one you can field in numbers and use well. That surviving to fight tomorrow matters more than dying gloriously today. The technical details of what made reverse tactics possible deserve deeper examination. The Sherman's transmission system was key. Early M4S used a manually shifted 5-speed synchromesh transmission with a controlled differential for steering. Shifting into reverse gear under fire required skill, but experienced drivers could do it in seconds. Later models, particularly the M4A3, incorporated improvements that made the process even smoother. The Sherman's track design also mattered. Wide tracks with 23-inch wide shoes distributed weight effectively, providing good traction in reverse even on muddy or sloped terrain. This contrasted with German heavy tanks whose narrow tracks, despite their weight, sometimes struggled with reverse movement on difficult ground. A Panther, trying to reverse up a slope, might lose traction. A Sherman usually didn't. Vision was crucial. The Sherman commander sat high in the turret, surrounded by vision blocks that provided nearly 360-degree awareness. When reversing, the commander could see obstacles, guide the driver, and maintain situational awareness. German tanks, particularly the Panther and Tiger, had more limited rear vision. Their commanders could direct forward movement well but struggled with rapid reverse operations. The tactical application of reverse movement varied by situation. In offensive operations, tanks would advance to contact, identify enemy positions, then reverse to hull-down positions while infantry and supporting weapons moved up. In defensive operations, tanks would position themselves on reverse slopes, exposing only their turret to engage approaching enemy armor, then reverse further behind the ridge if enemy fire became too intense. Coordination with infantry was essential. Tank-infantry cooperation in World War II was often poor, but units that mastered it found that reverse tactics enhanced rather than hindered cooperation. Tanks could provide covering fire while reversing to positions that protected both the tank and accompanying infantry. Infantry could mark safe reverse routes with colored smoke or fabric panels, giving tank commanders confidence to retreat quickly without checking every meter of ground. Artillery support integrated with reverse tactics beautifully. Tank commanders would identify enemy positions, call in artillery coordinates while reversing to safety, then advance again after artillery suppressed the enemy. This created a rhythm of engagement: advance, identify, reverse, call fire, advance again. German defenders found this pattern extremely difficult to counter because American tanks never stayed in one position long enough to be effectively engaged. The material cost of reverse tactics was significant but acceptable. Engines worked harder when reversing under load, particularly uphill. Transmissions wore faster. Track life decreased, but these were maintenance issues, not combat failures. American logistics could replace worn engines. German logistics often couldn't, which meant German tanks that could theoretically outfight Shermans sometimes sat immobilized for lack of spare parts while Shermans kept rolling. Weather affected reverse tactics in complex ways. In dry conditions, reversing kicked up dust clouds that marked your position a liability, but dust also obscured aim, which meant enemy gunners struggled to hit a reversing tank even if they could see it. In rain or snow, reverse movement was slower and more treacherous, but reduced visibility meant you could disengage before enemy gunners acquired proper aim. Skilled crews learned to exploit weather conditions as another tactical variable. The night fighting dimension cannot be ignored. In darkness, reverse tactics became even more potent. American tanks had better night vision equipment than most German vehicles, not superior technology, just slightly better periscopes and crew training for night operations. A Sherman that engaged at night, fired a few shots, then reversed into darkness became nearly impossible to track. German crews, using less effective night vision aids, often had no idea where their attacker had gone. Radio communication enabled tactical coordination that multiplied the effectiveness of reverse movements. American tank platoons and companies had excellent radio equipment. A platoon leader could coordinate 5 tanks engaging from different positions, all ready to reverse on command when enemy fire intensified. German forces, with more limited radio availability, struggled to coordinate defensive responses against enemy armor that engaged from multiple positions then disappeared. The cost, in human terms, must be acknowledged. Even with reverse tactics, Sherman crews died. Accidents happened, tanks reversing over cliffs, into ditches, over friendly mines. Communication failures occurred, drivers reversing when commanders intended forward movement, causing collisions or exposing the tank to flank fire. And sometimes, reverse tactics simply failed. Enemy gunners got lucky. Terrain prevented withdrawal. Mechanical failures trapped tanks in killing zones. But these failures, tragic as they were, don't invalidate the overall effectiveness of the tactic. Every combat technique has a failure rate. The question is whether it reduces casualties compared to alternatives. The evidence suggests reverse tactics did exactly that. They weren't perfect. They didn't make Shermans invulnerable. They simply made Sherman crews more likely to survive encounters that would otherwise have been fatal. The long-term impact on American military thinking was profound. Post-war armor development explicitly incorporated features that supported reverse combat. The M48 Patton tank, entering service in the 1950s, had even better reverse speed than the Sherman. The M60, succeeding the M48, maintained this capability. The M1 Abrams, designed in the late Cold War, can reverse at speeds exceeding most World War II tanks' forward speeds. This wasn't accident, it was institutional memory from men who'd learned in Shermans that reverse movement under fire was a legitimate combat tactic. Training doctrine changed too. Armor officer courses began teaching reverse tactics explicitly. Tank gunnery ranges incorporated reverse movement drills. Field exercises tested units on their ability to disengage under fire. What had been desperate improvisation in Normandy became official doctrine by the Korean War and remained central to American armor tactics through Vietnam, Desert Storm, Iraq, and Afghanistan. The psychological preparation required for reverse tactics also influenced training. Modern American armored forces emphasize crew cohesion and communication more than most armies. This traces directly to Sherman crew's experience that successful reverse combat required absolute trust between commander and driver, between gunner and loader, between all crew members. You can't reverse blind into potential danger unless you trust your crew completely. Building that trust became a training priority. Sergeant Koslowski made it to Germany. His original crew, the men who'd learned reverse tactics together in the bocage, fought through Belgium and across the Rhine. They ended the war in Czechoslovakia, alive, having crewed 3 different Shermans as vehicles were knocked out beneath them. Knocked out, but not destroyed. Mission killed, not crew killed. They walked away from burning tanks because they'd learned that backing up wasn't surrender. It was survival. It was tactics. It was how you lived long enough to win. Years after the war, Koslowski would tell his grandchildren about those months in Europe. He wouldn't talk much about the killing, about rounds punching through steel, about friends who didn't escape burning tanks. But he would talk about his driver, about the absolute trust required to reverse blind through hedge-lined lanes while German shells searched for them, about the strange courage it took to turn your back to enemy fire, about learning that survival wasn't shameful and retreat wasn't defeat, about discovering that sometimes going backward was the only way to go forward. His grandchildren, raised on war movies showing American tanks charging toward glory, struggled to understand. How was backing up brave? How was running away heroic? Koslowski would smile and try to explain that courage isn't absence of fear but intelligent response to it. That heroism isn't dying needlessly but surviving to complete the mission. That the fastest way home from war is staying alive long enough to finish it. These lessons, learned in Sherman tanks backing away from German guns, represent something profound about how Americans fight wars. We don't have conscript armies accustomed to accepting massive casualties. We don't have autocratic governments that can spend lives without political consequence. We have citizen soldiers who expect their military to use them intelligently, to preserve their lives when possible, to win through brains as much as bravery. Reverse tactics embodied these values perfectly. They also exposed tensions between American martial mythology and military reality. We want to believe that Americans win through superior courage, through aggressive spirit, through refusing to retreat. The reality is messier and more interesting. Americans win by adapting faster, by learning from mistakes, by finding tactical advantages even when fighting with inferior equipment. They win not by never retreating, but by making retreat itself a weapon. They win by surviving when the enemy expects them to die. The Sherman tank, maligned as a death trap, criticized as inadequate, mocked as inferior to German armor, ended the war having destroyed more enemy tanks than any other Allied vehicle. Not because it was better, but because there were more of them, crewed by men who'd learned to use them intelligently, who'd learned that the engine compartment could be sacrificial armor, who'd learned that reverse wasn't retreat, who'd learned that 4-time survival rates came not from better steel but from better tactics. When you hear someone dismiss the Sherman as inadequate, remember this story. Remember crews backing into enemy fire, Engines taking hits meant for crew compartments, men walking away from knocked-out tanks to crew new ones. Remember that weapon effectiveness isn't measured in specifications but in results, and remember that sometimes the most important tactical innovation isn't advancing better, it's retreating smarter. The fastest way forward was backward. American Sherman crews proved it, 4 times better survival rates at a time. They paid for that knowledge in blood and fear, and friends lost. But they learned it, taught it, passed it down. And in doing so, they changed how America fights wars. They proved that tactical intelligence matters more than technological superiority. That surviving matters more than charging. That going backward can be the bravest thing you do. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.